The phone rang at 3:17 a.m., and I knew before I even opened my eyes that something was wrong. You don't get calls at that hour unless someone's dead, dying, or in jail. At 62, I'd received all 3 types, but nothing could have prepared me for what I heard next. "Miss Ferris, this is St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about Rayleigh. She's here, and she finally knows who she is." I sat up so fast I knocked over my reading glasses. The nurse was still talking, but my brain had stopped processing words after Rayleigh, my daughter's name. My daughter, who died 37 years ago. "I'm sorry," I managed to croak out. "There must be some mistake. My daughter Rayleigh died in 1988. We buried her. I visit her grave every Sunday." There was a pause. "Ma'am, the woman here insists she's Rayleigh Ferris. She has identification issues, but she knew to ask for you, for Camilla Trevino, formerly Camilla Ferris, my maiden name. Nobody had called me Camilla Ferris since Harold died 9 years ago. My name is Camilla Trevino, and I'm 62 years old. I raised 4 children, buried one, divorced one husband, buried another, and thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me, but sitting there in my empty house at 3 a.m, holding a phone that suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds, I realized I hadn't seen anything yet. Before I continue, if you could take a moment to like this video and comment where you're watching from and what time it is there, it would mean the world to me. Thank you. The accident happened in October 1988. Rayleigh was 3 years old, all blonde curls and mischief, the kind of child who could charm cookies out of anyone. Harold had taken her to visit his brother Wayne for the weekend. I stayed home with our older kids. Michael was 7, Jennifer was 5, and baby Thomas was just 6 months old. I remember being grateful for the break. Isn't that horrible? I was grateful for the break, and then I never saw my baby again. The call came Sunday evening. Harold's voice was wrong, hollow like someone had scooped out his insides. There'd been an accident, a multi-car pileup on Highway 49. Rayleigh didn't make it. The next days blurred together like watercolors in rain. Wayne worked at the county morgue then, which was supposed to be a blessing. He could fast-track the paperwork, spare us additional pain. The casket was closed. Harold insisted. He'd identified her, he said, and I didn't need to see her like that. I remember fighting him, screaming that I needed to say goodbye properly. But his family convinced me to spare myself the trauma. "Remember her as she was," his mother had said, holding me while I sobbed. "Remember her laughing." So I did. For 37 years, I remembered her laughing. I visited her grave every Sunday, bringing fresh daisies in spring, chrysanthemums in fall. I talked to that little headstone like she could hear me, updating her on her siblings' lives, their kids, all the things she'd never get to do. But now, at 3:23 a.m. on a random Tuesday in November, some nurse was telling me there was a 40-year-old woman at St. Mary's claiming to be my dead daughter. How did she know to ask for me? I heard myself ask. She's been having episodes of clarity, memory fragments. Your name was one of the first clear things she said. That and something about a yellow sundress with strawberries on it. My coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the kitchen tile. Rayleigh's favorite dress, the one she'd begged to wear every single day, the one I'd buried her in or thought I had. "Ma'am, are you still there?" "The woman," I whispered. "Does she have a birthmark?" "I'm not sure I can—" Behind her left ear, shaped like a tiny butterfly. The paws stretched like taffy. "You need to come to the hospital, Miss Ferris. Room 314. I drove those 18 miles in my pajamas and Harold's old cardigan, the one I couldn't bring myself to donate because it still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco. My hands shook so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. This had to be a mistake. Some con artist who'd researched our family. But how would they know about the dress? We'd never talked about it publicly. It wasn't in any obituary. The hospital at night felt like a different planet. All fluorescent lights and whispered conversations. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor lasted approximately 17 years. When I finally stood outside room 314, I couldn't make myself go in. What if it was her? Worse, what if it wasn't? That's when I heard it. Soft, barely audible through the door. Someone was humming. The melody hit me like a physical blow. The lullaby I'd made up for Rayleigh. Nonsense words set to a tune I'd created during one of her colicky nights. I'd never sung it to my other children. It was hers alone, our secret song. My legs gave out, and I slumped against the wall. A passing nurse rushed over, probably thinking I was having a heart attack. In a way, I was. "The woman in that room," I gasped. "She has my daughter's birthmark, doesn't she?" The nurse helped me to a chair, her face a professional mask of sympathy, but her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Whatever was waiting behind that door was about to shatter everything I'd believed for 37 years. I pushed open the door at 3:47 a.m., and time folded in on itself like origami. The woman in the bed was 40 years old, but lying there, she looked fragile as spun glass. Her hair was darker than Rayleigh's had been, brown with premature silver streaks, but the way it curled at her temples, that was exactly the same. "Rayleigh?" The name came out strangled. She turned and I had to grab the door frame. Those eyes, Harold's eyes, green with gold flecks, the eyes that had haunted me for decades, but it was the way she tilted her head, that little bird-like movement Rayleigh used to do when she was curious, that broke me. Are you my mother?" Her voice was uncertain, like someone trying to speak a language they'd only heard in dreams. I couldn't answer. I was too busy cataloging every detail. The nose, definitely mine, the stubborn chin, all Harold. The way her hands moved when she was nervous, fingers dancing an invisible piano. Pure Rayleigh. But this was impossible. We'd had a funeral. There was a death certificate, a grave I'd tended for 37 years. Dr. Marcus Chen entered, all gentle authority and careful words. He was maybe 35 with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the sort of doctor who probably still made house calls. "Mrs. Trevino, I'm Dr. Chen. I've been treating Jane, that's what we've been calling her, for the past 6 months." 6 months, my voice cracked. "She's been here 6 months and no one called me. She was brought in after a severe car accident. No identification, no family. Traumatic brain injury left her with significant amnesia. We've been working through recovery, and recently she's been having breakthrough memories. Your name, specific details about a childhood that seemed to belong to someone else. The woman who might be Rayleigh reached out tentatively. I remember things that don't make sense. A kitchen with sunflower wallpaper. A dog named Biscuit. A woman singing to me about rainbow fish and silver wishes. Our kitchen in 1988. Our beagle. My made-up lullaby. "Tell me about the yellow dress," I whispered, her face scrunched up, concentrating. "It had strawberries, little red strawberries with green leaves. I loved it because..." She paused, frustrated. "Because you said I looked like summer sunshine in it." Those were my exact words. My exact words that I'd never told another soul. "We need to be cautious," Dr. Chen said gently. "Memory is complex. Sometimes trauma victims unconsciously absorb details from external sources. I've suggested DNA testing to be certain." "Do it," I said immediately. Then, to the woman who might be my daughter, "Do you remember the accident, the one when you were 3? She shook her head, then winced at the movement. "I remember a long car ride, a man who smelled like cigarettes and peppermint, being scared. Then nothing until I was maybe 7 or 8, living with..." She trailed off, confused. "Different people. But they said they were my parents." What were their names? My detective instincts, honed by 40 years of being a high school principal, kicked in. David and Ruth Holbrook. But that doesn't feel right anymore. Nothing feels right. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I've been nobody for 6 months, and now I might be somebody who's supposed to be dead. Do you have any idea how insane that sounds?" I sat on the edge of her bed, my hand hovering over hers, afraid to touch, afraid not to. "Honey, I once caught a student who'd trained a hamster to steal hall passes. After teaching teenagers for 30 years, nothing sounds insane anymore." She laughed, a surprised, rusty sound. And suddenly she was 3 again, giggling at my silly faces. That's when I saw it. When she laughed, her head tilted back, revealing the spot behind her left ear. The birthmark was there, faded but unmistakable, a tiny butterfly ready to take flight. "Oh my God," I breathed. Dr. Chen leaned in. "Mrs. Trevino. It's her birthmark. Exactly where it should be." I turned to him, my principal voice taking over. "How fast can you run that DNA test? 72 hours for a standard test, but I can push for priority processing. Do it. And I want to see everything. Her medical records, how she was found, everything. The next 2 hours blurred together. Forms, blood draws, questions. The woman I was already thinking of as Rayleigh answered what she could. She'd lived in Sacramento as Ruth and David's daughter. They'd died 5 years ago. She'd been married briefly, no children, worked as a librarian, which made me smile because Rayleigh had loved books even at 3. The accident 6 months ago had erased much of her adult life, but kept pushing these older memories to the surface. There's something else, she said as dawn painted the room pink. I dream about water, being in water, under it, someone pulling me out. But the man who pulls me out isn't the man who smelled like peppermint. My blood chilled. What did he look like? Younger. Scared. He kept saying, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, over and over. Wayne. Harold's younger brother, Wayne, who'd worked at the morgue, who'd handled the paperwork, who died of a heart attack 15 years ago, taking any answers with him. As I left the hospital at 7 a.m., promising to return after grabbing clothes and calling my other children, my mind raced. If this woman was Rayleigh, and every instinct screamed she was, then what had we buried in 1988? Who had we buried? And why had Harold, my supposedly devoted husband, been so insistent on that closed casket? The drive home felt like swimming through molasses. I needed to check something. A nagging detail that had bothered me for 37 years, but I'd pushed aside in my grief. Harold had never wanted to visit Rayleigh's grave with me, not once in the 23 years before he died. He'd said it was too painful, and I'd accepted that because people grieve differently. But what if it wasn't grief? What if it was guilt? One thing was certain. I was about to excavate more than just memories, and something told me that the little grave I'd been tending all these years might hold secrets darker than death itself. 72 hours. That's how long Dr. Chen said the DNA test would take with priority processing. I spent the first 12 calling my children, and let me tell you, there's no good way to start that conversation. Michael, it's Mom. No, everything's fine. Well, actually, your sister might be alive. No, not Jennifer. Rayleigh. Yes, I know we buried her in 1988. Michael, ever the pragmatist, immediately went into lawyer mode. He'd inherited Harold's logical brain along with his stubborn streak. Mom, you need to be careful. This could be a scam. Has she asked for money? Jennifer was crying before I finished the first sentence. Mom, that's impossible. We went to her funeral. I remember it. You remember a funeral? I corrected. We never saw her. Thomas, my baby who'd never known his sister, was the only one who didn't argue. Mom, if there's even a chance, we have to know. By hour 13, I was at home, searching through Harold's things more carefully. That's when I remembered something. Harold had been paranoid about the garage being broken into about a year after Rayleigh's death. He'd installed new locks, moved things around. Now I wondered if he'd been hiding something. Behind old paint cans covered in dust, I found it, a locked metal box. Inside were photocopies of documents, bank statements, and 3 photographs that made my blood freeze. Rayleigh at age 4, 5, and 6, alive. Living with another family, Harold had known. He'd known she was alive. My hands shaking, I called Michael. Get over here, now, and bring your laptop. While waiting, I studied the bank statements. Regular deposits of $20,000, once a year for 5 years, starting in 1989. Always in October, always from a company called Brennan Family Services. Brennan. Why did that name sound familiar? Michael arrived and immediately went into research mode. Judge William Brennan, Family Court. He's been on the bench for 30 years. Dad appeared before him a few times for property disputes. Harold knew him, I said slowly. They played poker together sometimes. Michael's fingers flew over the keyboard. Mom, this is bigger than just Rayleigh. Look. He turned the screen toward me. 3 other children died in closed casket accidents between 1987 and 1989. In our county, all death certificates were processed through Wayne's office. 3 other families, 3 other graves. How many were empty? By hour 36, I was parked outside the county records office. Martha Henley, who'd worked there since the Carter administration, didn't even blink when I asked for the October 1988 accident reports. Terrible thing, that pileup, she said, adjusting her bifocals. 7 dead, including 2 children. Your Harold's brother Wayne handled most of the identifications, being with the coroner's office and all. The report was frustratingly sparse, but something caught my eye. Only 6 bodies were listed in the final coroner's report, not 7. Martha, who would have the original coroner's files? Those would be in deep storage, but she leaned in conspiratorially. Wayne's widow, Margaret, kept a lot of his work papers. She's at Sunset Manor now, the memory care unit. Margaret was in the day room, staring at nothing. At 81, she looked like a bird made of tissue paper and regret. Margaret, it's Camilla, Harold's wife. Her eyes sharpened with fear. Camilla, I can't talk about it. My heart stopped. Talk about what, Margaret? Wayne said never to tell. Made me promise. But he's gone. Harold's gone, and I'm so tired of carrying it. She grabbed my hand with surprising strength. The little girl, she wasn't in the car. The room tilted. What do you mean she wasn't in the car? Wayne called that night crying. Said Harold had gotten into terrible trouble, gambling debts to dangerous people. But it wasn't Harold's idea to give her up. That judge, Brennan, he already had buyers. Rich couples who couldn't have children. He targeted families in trouble. Debt, immigration problems, custody issues. Made it look like accidents, deaths, Wayne had to help, or Brennan would have destroyed him too. They sold children? My voice was barely a whisper. Brennan ran it all. He'd identify vulnerable families in his courtroom, families with problems that money could solve. Then he'd approach them when they were desperate. Harold tried to back out, Wayne said. But Brennan had already taken money for Rayleigh. Said if Harold didn't cooperate, those men he owed would get addresses. Your address, the children's schools. Before I could ask more, Margaret started crying, confused, lost in her failing mind. But I had enough. If you're watching this, please take a moment to subscribe and like this video. Your support means everything to me and helps other families who might be searching for their own impossible answers. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. By hour 60, I was back at the hospital. Rayleigh was sitting up, color better, looking through an old photo album Jennifer had brought. That's you, Jennifer was saying, pointing to a picture. At your 3rd birthday party. You shoved your whole face in the cake. Rayleigh laughed, then looked confused. I remember cake. Chocolate with pink roses? Pink and yellow roses, I confirmed, sinking into the visitor's chair. You insisted on both colors. My children were trying so hard to believe. Michael kept asking probing questions like he was deposing a witness. Jennifer wouldn't stop crying. Thomas just stared, probably trying to reconcile this grown woman with the sister he'd never known. The DNA results came back at hour 71. Dr. Chen called me to his office privately first. Mrs. Trevino, the results are conclusive. 99.97% probability of maternal match. This woman is your biological daughter. The floor didn't open up and swallow me. The world didn't end. It just kept spinning while everything I'd believed for 37 years rearranged itself like a sliding puzzle. How was all I managed? That's not a medical question I can answer. But what I can tell you is that she's been living as Ruth and David Holbrook's daughter since approximately age 4. They're both deceased, but I did some checking. They were listed as adoptive parents, though the paperwork is unusual. Unusual how? The adoption was processed in Nevada, rushed through sealed records, the kind of thing that happened sometimes in the 80s when people had money and connections. Money. Harold's gambling debts miraculously paid. Our daughter disappeared. It was all connecting like a horrible constellation. That night, I sat by Rayleigh's bedside while she slept. My other children had gone home to process, to explain to their own kids that their aunt was suddenly alive. I studied her face, seeing echoes of the toddler she'd been, the woman she'd become without me. My phone buzzed. An unknown number had sent a text. Stop digging or you'll bury more than the truth. For the first time since that 3 a.m. phone call, I felt afraid. Not confused, not heartbroken, but genuinely afraid. Because whoever had orchestrated this 37 years ago might still be out there, and they clearly didn't want the truth about that empty grave to come to light. But they'd underestimated me. I'd been a high school principal for 30 years. I'd faced down drug dealers recruiting on campus, parents who thought their precious angels could do no wrong, and a superintendent who'd tried to embezzle from the music program. Some anonymous coward with a burner phone wasn't going to stop me now. Tomorrow, I decided, I was going to petition to have that grave opened, because the only thing worse than burying your child is finding out you never buried them at all. And somewhere, another family might be missing their baby too, never knowing she'd been sleeping in my daughter's grave for 37 years. The real question was, how many other families were out there, tending graves that held the wrong children? And who had enough power and cruelty to orchestrate such an elaborate lie? The DNA confirmation changed everything. Rayleigh, I could finally think of her by her real name, was truly my daughter. But it also meant we had evidence of a crime. Michael immediately contacted the FBI. This is kidnapping, Mom. Federal crime. No statute of limitations when it involves fraud and conspiracy across state lines. The FBI arrived within hours. Agent Martinez, a woman who looked like she could stare down granite, took over the investigation. Mrs. Trevino, if what you're telling me is true, this could be one of the largest child trafficking operations we've ever uncovered. I showed her everything. The photos from Harold's hidden box, the bank statements, Margaret's testimony recorded on my phone. Martinez's expression grew grimmer with each piece of evidence. "We need to move fast," she said. "Judge Brennan is 3 months from retirement. If he suspects we're on to him..." But Brennan had already made his move. That evening, Margaret Ferris was found dead in her room at Sunset Manor. Natural causes, they said. Heart failure. But the timing was too convenient, and her medical files from earlier that day showed no cardiac issues. "He's cleaning house," Martinez said grimly. "We need those other families. Now." Michael had already tracked down the first family. The Chin still lived in town, still visited their daughter's grave every Qingming festival. When we showed up at their door with Agent Martinez, Mrs. Chen collapsed before we could even explain. "I knew," she sobbed in her husband's arms. "A mother knows. I knew something was wrong. The casket, the closed casket. She was so small. How could the damage be so bad we couldn't see her?" Their daughter, Sarah, was living in Portland under the name Susan Park, alive, married with 2 kids. The Chens had grandchildren they'd never known existed. The Williams family had moved to Texas, but we found them. Their son Marcus was now Martin Brooks, a software engineer in Seattle. The Rodriguez family took the longest to locate. They'd returned to Mexico after their daughter's supposed death, carrying their grief across borders. Each family had the same story. Sudden accident, closed casket, Wayne handling the arrangements, and each family had been vulnerable. Mr. Chen had owed money to the wrong people. Mr. Williams had been about to lose his business to creditors. The Rodriguez family had been facing deportation. Brennan knew exactly which families to target, Martinez said, going through the files we'd assembled. Vulnerable families with serious problems that could be solved with money and a missing child. 2 weeks into the investigation, Harold's safety deposit box at First National Bank was opened by federal warrant. Inside, along with cash and more photos, were 10 sealed letters addressed to me and one cassette tape labeled October 1st, 1988, The Truth. I insisted on listening to it immediately, there in the bank's private room with Agent Martinez present. Harold's voice filled the room, younger, desperate, frightened. "Camilla, if you're listening to this, something has happened to me. You need to know the truth about that night. Brennan came to the house while you were at your mother's with the kids, said he had a solution to my debt problem. I thought he meant a loan, but he explained his whole operation, stealing children, selling them to desperate families. I told him no, God as my witness, Camilla. I told him no. My hands were shaking. Harold had tried to refuse, but Brennan said it was already in motion. He'd already promised Rayleigh to the Holbrooks, already taken their money, $300,000. If I didn't cooperate, he'd make sure Marcus's crew knew exactly where to find us, all of us. He showed me surveillance photos. You at the grocery store, Michael at soccer practice, Jennifer at ballet. He'd been watching us for weeks. "This proves coercion," Martinez said, taking notes. "Your husband was a victim, too," the tape continued. I tried to go to the FBI the next day, but Brennan had people there too. Detective Morrison, Agent Kyle. They said Brennan owned half the system. If I talked, we'd all disappear. Not just Rayleigh. All of us. I had to choose between losing one child or losing all of them. God forgive me. I chose to save who I could. The letters confirmed everything. Harold had spent years trying to find Rayleigh, hiring private investigators with money he'd hidden from me, documenting everything he could about Brennan's operation. He'd been building a case, gathering evidence, but died before he could use it. One letter contained a list, 45 names, 45 children Brennan had stolen over 30 years. 45, Martinez breathed. Jesus Christ. The arrests happened at dawn 3 days later. Judge Brennan in handcuffs, dragged from his mansion in his pajamas. 2 other judges, 5 social workers, 3 funeral directors, a dozen medical professionals, even Detective Morrison and Agent Kyle, though Kyle had died 3 years prior. Brennan's wife screamed about mistakes and misunderstandings, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing millions in offshore accounts, adoption papers with his signature death certificates for living children. In Brennan's home safe, they found records of everything. Every child stolen, every family destroyed, every dollar collected. He'd kept meticulous records, like a businessman tracking inventory, because to him, that's all these children were. Inventory. But the most shocking discovery was a second set of books showing where some of the children had really gone. Not all were sold to desperate couples wanting families. Some were sold to people with darker purposes, shipped overseas, disappeared into shadows we didn't want to imagine. We found 12 of them, Martinez told me privately. 12 who went to legitimate adoptive families like your Rayleigh. The others, she shook her head, were working with international agencies, but after 40 years, the media explosion was instant. The stolen children, a judge's 30-year conspiracy. Every news outlet in the country wanted our story. My lawn became a circus of satellite trucks and reporters. Rayleigh was struggling with it all. The memories were coming back in floods now. Harold's laugh, my singing, her siblings' faces, but also the Holbrooks teaching her to ride a bike, their bedtime stories, their love to complete lives trying to exist in one mind. I don't know who I am, she confessed one night. Am I your daughter who was stolen or their daughter who was saved? Because, Mom, they did save me in a way. If what Harold says is true, if those men would have hurt all of us, you're both, I said firmly. You're our daughter who was protected the only way Harold could think of. You're also their daughter who was loved and raised. Both things are true. She cried then, really cried, for everything lost and found and confused between. Eleanor Holbrook, David's sister, reached out the next week. We had no idea, she said over coffee. David and Ruth were told she was an orphan from Nevada. They paid $300,000 because they were told it covered medical care, legal fees, housing for the birth mother. They would be horrified to know the truth. They loved her? I asked, needing to know. More than life itself. She was their miracle. 2 families loving the same child, both innocent of the crime that connected them. It was tragedy, layered on tragedy, with love as both the wound and the healing. The real shock came during Brennan's interrogation. He confessed, but not with shame, with pride. I gave those children better lives, he insisted. The adoptive families could provide more, better education, better opportunities. Look at them now, doctors, engineers, successful people. Would they have achieved that in their original circumstances? That wasn't your choice to make, Martinez shot back. I was a family court judge. I saw neglect, abuse, poverty. I found a solution that helped everyone. You destroyed 45 families for money. I saved 45 children from worse fates. His delusion was complete. He genuinely believed he'd been some kind of hero, saving children from their inadequate birth families. The fact that most of those families were only vulnerable because of temporary circumstances, debt, immigration issues, financial problems, didn't penetrate his certainty. But during his second interrogation, threatened with additional charges about the children who'd disappeared overseas, he finally cracked. There were others involved, higher up. people you can't touch. Try us, Martinez said. But Brennan never got the chance. He was found dead in his cell the next morning. Suicide, they said. Hung himself with his bedsheet. The cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned. The guard had taken an unscheduled break. Someone cleaned up their loose end, Martinez said grimly. This goes deeper than just Brennan. We'd uncovered the tip of an iceberg, and someone had dynamited the rest before we could see how deep it went. But we had our children back. 12 families reunited, 12 stolen children found. It wasn't everyone, but it was something. With Brennan dead, the investigation hit a wall. But I wasn't done digging. Harold had left more clues, and I was going to follow every single one. In his final letter, Harold had mentioned a storage unit. Unit 47 at Secure Store on Madison, paid through 2030. Everything I couldn't keep at home. Michael and I went together, Agent Martinez meeting us there with a warrant. The unit was small, cramped, and filled with boxes labeled by year. Harold had been investigating for 28 years. The 1989 box contained surveillance photos. Harold had hired someone to follow Rayleigh and the Holbrooks, first day of kindergarten, Christmas morning through a window birthday parties in the backyard, my daughter growing up in someone else's life, documented by her father who couldn't reach her. He was watching over her, Michael said softly. The only way he could. The 1995 box held something different, correspondence with other parents. Harold had found 3 other families whose children had died around the same time. They'd formed a secret group, meeting monthly in different cities, trying to piece together what had happened, but one by one, they'd given up or died. Harold was the last one still searching. The 2010 box was the jackpot. Harold had somehow gotten access to Brennan's computer files, probably through the private investigator he'd hired. Spreadsheets of children, dates, amounts, locations, but also something else, references to the network. This is bigger than just Brennan, Martinez said, studying the files. He was middle management. There's a whole organization. The network, according to Harold's notes, operated in 12 states. Judges, social workers, doctors, funeral directors, all strategically placed to identify vulnerable families and facilitate the trafficking. Brennan was just the regional coordinator for Northern California. 45 children in our region alone, Martinez calculated. If there are 12 regions, over 500 children, Michael finished. Over 30 years. The scale was staggering. But Harold had been smart. He'd made copies of everything, hidden them in different places. Even if someone found one cache, others would survive. That evening, Eleanor Holbrook called. "Camilla, I found something. David kept journals. I think you should see them." David Holbrook's journals painted a picture of a loving father who'd always suspected something was wrong. He'd noticed Rayleigh's nightmares about water, her fear of peppermint smell, the way she'd sometimes call out for a different mommy in her sleep. Susan asked about her birth parents again today. We told her the same story. Car accident, no surviving family, but she looked at me like she knew I was lying. How can a 7-year-old's eyes hold such accusation? Another entry. Ruth wants to hire a therapist. Susan keeps drawing pictures of a yellow dress she says she remembers, but we never bought her anything like that. Where do these memories come from? They'd known something was wrong but loved her too much to dig deeper, afraid of what they'd find. David tried to investigate once, Eleanor told me, when Susan was 15, but he got a visit from some men who suggested he stop looking into the adoption. They knew things about his business, about Ruth's medical history. The threat was clear. The network had been monitoring all the adoptive families too, making sure no one looked too closely at where their miracles had come from. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Winters, the pediatrician who'd provided false death certificates, had flipped. Facing life in prison, she decided to cooperate fully. "I was young, in debt from medical school," she told us in the interrogation room, looking haggard. "Brennan offered to pay off my loans if I helped with just one child. Then it was another, and another. By the time I realized how deep I was, they had enough on me to destroy my career, my life." She provided names, dozens of names. The network structure started to emerge, a hydra of corruption reaching into every aspect of the system meant to protect children. "There's someone you need to know about," Winters said. "Robert Sterling. He runs a foundation called New Beginnings. On paper, it's a charity helping place hard-to-adopt children. In reality, it's the network's legitimate front. He's untouchable. Senators, governors, they all praise his work. Robert Sterling. I'd heard that name. He'd been at Harold's funeral, offering condolences. He'd known. He'd stood there knowing what had happened to Rayleigh and offered me sympathy for my loss. Martinez's team raided New Beginnings the next day, but the offices had been cleared out, computers wiped, documents shredded. Sterling himself was in Switzerland, conveniently unavailable. "We'll get him," Martinez promised. "It might take time, but we'll get him." Meanwhile, more families were coming forward. The support group now had 30 members, all navigating the impossible space between grief and joy. Some had found their children alive. Others had confirmed their worst fears. Their children really had died, just not when or how they'd been told. Rayleigh was slowly building a relationship with her siblings. Michael, the protective older brother, Jennifer, the emotional sister, Thomas, the younger brother, who'd never known her, but always felt something was missing. Family dinners were awkward, but healing, full of inside jokes she didn't understand and memories she didn't share. "I feel like an intruder sometimes," she admitted, "like I'm taking the place of their real sister." "You are their real sister," I insisted. "You're just the director's cut. Deleted scenes now restored." She laughed at that, and it sounded more like the laugh I remembered from when she was 3. One evening, going through more of Harold's papers, I found something that stopped my heart. A receipt for a storage unit in Sacramento paid for under a fake name. The address was 3 blocks from where Rayleigh had lived as Susan Holbrook. "He had a place near you," I told Rayleigh. "He was watching over you even if he couldn't be with you." We drove to Sacramento together. The storage unit was smaller than the first, but more personal. Photos of our family covered one wall. Her childhood drawings I thought we'd lost in a flood. The yellow strawberry dress, carefully preserved in plastic. But the most heartbreaking discovery was a collection of letters. One for every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone Harold had missed. All addressed to "my darling Rayleigh," all unsent. "Today you turn 16. I wonder if you still love chocolate cake with pink and yellow roses. I wonder if you still tilt your head when you're thinking. I wonder if you remember us at all, or if we're just shadows of shadows now." Rayleigh read each letter, tears streaming down her face. "He never forgot me. He never forgave himself either," I said, holding her as she cried. The investigation expanded internationally. The network had connections in Eastern Europe, South America, Southeast Asia. Not all the children had gone to loving families seeking adoption. Some had disappeared into trafficking rings, sold to the highest bidder for purposes too horrible to contemplate. "We've identified 8 international cases connected to Brennan's region," Martinez updated us. 3 have been located. The others, she shook her head. 3 found. 5 still missing. 5 families who would never get the reunion we'd had. The media attention was relentless. Every family had reporters camped outside their homes. The story had gone international. The Great Child Theft Conspiracy. Netflix was already planning a documentary. Book deals were being offered. Everyone wanted to monetize our trauma. But something good came from the attention. A tech billionaire whose own daughter had been kidnapped years ago funded a new DNA database specifically for matching missing children with families. Within the first month, 3 more of Brennan's victims were identified. Tommy Chen, the pediatric surgeon, flew in from Boston to meet his biological family, watching him reunite with his parents, seeing the same eyes, the same smile, the same mannerisms despite 32 years apart. It was proof that family is more than just proximity. "I dreamed about you," he told his mother. "Even though I didn't know who you were, I dreamed about a woman who sang Mandarin lullabies." Marcus Williams brought his own children to meet their biological grandparents. His 10-year-old daughter was the image of Mrs. Williams at that age. "It's like looking at a ghost," Mrs. Williams whispered, "but a wonderful ghost." The Rodriguez family's reunion was complicated by distance and language. But love needs no translation. Elena and her birth mother just held each other and cried for an hour, saying everything without words. But not all reunions were happy. Some of the stolen children wanted nothing to do with their birth families. They'd built lives, had families of their own, and didn't want to disrupt everything for strangers who happened to share DNA. "It's their choice," I told a mother whose son had refused contact. "We lost the right to demand anything when we lost them, even if it wasn't our fault." The support group evolved, helping families navigate not just reunions but rejections, partial connections, complicated relationships. We were all writing the handbook as we lived it. 6 months after that first phone call, Robert Sterling was arrested at the Swiss border trying to flee to a non-extradition country. He'd been running the network for 15 years, taking over from someone else who'd run it for 15 before that. It was a generational crime, passed down like some sick family business. His arrest led to more revelations. The network had placed over 800 children over 40 years across the country. Politicians' children, celebrities' children, anyone who could pay the premium prices and wouldn't ask too many questions. Some of these adoptive parents had to know, Martinez said. You don't pay $2 million for an adoption and not suspect something. But proving knowledge versus willful ignorance was nearly impossible. The adoptive families had been given perfect paperwork, believable stories, official-looking documentation they'd wanted to believe, so they had. Eleanor Holbrook became an unexpected ally in pushing for legislation. "New beginnings fooled us all," she said at a congressional hearing, "but there were signs we chose not to see. We need better oversight, mandatory DNA testing, open records. No child should disappear into the system." Rayleigh's law was passed in California first, then spread to other states. It required DNA samples for all adoptions, open casket viewings for child deaths unless medically inadvisable, and a national database for missing children that crossed state lines. But laws couldn't heal the wounds. That took time, therapy, and a lot of awkward family dinners. "Pass the potatoes," Rayleigh said at Thanksgiving, and it sounded so normal, so regular that everyone started crying. "Great," Thomas joked through his tears. 40 years to get a sister and she makes us cry over carbs." We laughed then, all of us, and for a moment, we weren't a family torn apart and stitched back together. We were just family. The Sterling arrest triggered an avalanche. Every day brought new revelations, new arrests, new families discovering their children were alive. The network had been vast. Judges, social workers, doctors, cops, adoption agencies, even some people in Witness Protection Administration. They'd created a pipeline for children to disappear and reappear with new identities, new families, new lives. "It's the largest human trafficking ring in U.S. history," the Attorney General announced at a press conference, "and it operated in plain sight for 40 years. Our support group grew to over 100 families. We met in a high school gymnasium now, the church basement long outgrown. The recovered, the media still called us, though we'd started calling ourselves the found. Each meeting brought new stories. The Johnsons discovered their son was a senator's aide in Washington. The Garcias found their daughter running a restaurant in Miami. The Nguyens learned their son had become a pediatric surgeon, driven by memories he couldn't quite place of being separated from his family. But for every reunion, there was a rejection. Some of the stolen children didn't want to be found. They'd built lives on the lies they'd been told, and the truth threatened everything they'd become. "My son says I'm disrupting his life," Mrs. Patterson told the group, her voice breaking. "He has a family, children who think their grandparents are dead. He doesn't want to confuse them with the truth. Give him time," I advised, though I knew time didn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it just scarred them over. Rayleigh had become the unofficial spokesperson for the stolen children. She was articulate, compassionate, and understood both sides of the story. "We're not choosing between families," she explained at another congressional hearing. "We're trying to reconcile two truths. We were loved by the families who raised us, and we were stolen from the families who lost us. Both things are true. Both things matter." Her testimony helped pass federal legislation, the Found Children Act, which provided funding for reunification services, therapy, and legal support for affected families. But the most dramatic moment came when one of Sterling's lieutenants, facing life in prison, decided to flip. Marcus Webb had been the West Coast coordinator, and he had records Sterling thought had been destroyed. "There's a warehouse in Oakland," Webb told the FBI. Sterling kept copies of everything. He was paranoid about people betraying him, so he kept insurance. The warehouse raid was like opening a tomb. 40 years of records, photos of children with their before and after names, financial records showing the millions that had changed hands, and most horrifyingly, a subset of files marked special arrangements. These children didn't go to families, Martinez told me privately. They went to clients, overseas mostly. We're working with Interpol, but after this long, 15 children from our region alone had been sold internationally, not for adoption, for things that made everyone involved in the investigation need therapy. The public outcry was deafening. How had this happened? How had hundreds of children been stolen and sold while authorities looked the other way? The answer was simple and horrible. The network had picked vulnerable families who were less likely to be believed. Immigrants, people with criminal records, families already dealing with CPS people whose children could disappear and be dismissed as runaways or assumed casualties of their circumstances. They targeted us specifically, Mr. Chen said at one meeting. We were immigrants with limited English. Who would believe us over a judge? The trials began in spring. Sterling's was the main event, broadcast live, covered by every major network. He sat there in his expensive suit, looking like someone's grandfather, not a monster who'd sold children. His defense was similar to Brennan's. He'd saved these children from worse fates, given them better lives. The adoptive families who'd paid millions had provided opportunities the birth families never could have. Look at the statistics, his lawyer argued. 90% of the placed children went to college. They became doctors, lawyers, teachers. They succeeded. They succeeded despite being stolen, not because of it, the prosecutor countered. And what about the 10% who didn't go to loving families? What about the children sold overseas? What about the families destroyed by grief? I testified on day 3. I brought photos, 37 years of visiting an empty grave, 37 years of birthday cakes with no one to eat them, 37 years of Mother's Days with one child missing. Robert Sterling stood at my husband's funeral, I said, looking directly at him. He knew our daughter was alive. He knew my husband died of guilt, and he offered condolences that takes a special kind of evil. Sterling never flinched, never showed remorse, even when victims testified about what had happened to them overseas, even when parents sobbed about children who'd committed suicide, always feeling something was wrong with their lives, even when Rayleigh testified about the identity crisis that nearly drove her to self-harm. The verdict was guilty on all counts, life without parole. As they led him away, Sterling looked at the families in the gallery and said, "I gave your children better lives. Someday you'll thank me." The gallery erupted. Security had to restrain several parents. Mrs. Chen threw her shoe at him, hitting him squarely in the back of the head. Nobody blamed her, but Sterling's conviction was just the beginning. The trials would continue for years. Every person involved in the network faced justice, though some fled the country, and others mysteriously died before trial. The ripple effects were massive. Every adoption from the past 40 years was being reviewed. DNA testing became mandatory for all adoptions. Child death protocols were completely overhauled. But the biggest change was in the families themselves. We were rewriting what family meant. Biological and adoptive parents learning to coexist. Siblings meeting for the first time as adults. Grandchildren who had 3 or 4 sets of grandparents. "It's like a massive blended family," Rayleigh said at one particularly chaotic gathering. If the Brady Bunch had been orchestrated by criminals and revealed by DNA tests, dark humor had become our coping mechanism. It was either laugh or scream, and we'd all done enough screaming. The documentary came out a year later. Stolen Lives, The Network's Children. It was hard to watch ourselves on screen, reliving the worst moments of our lives for entertainment, but it also helped other families come forward. By the end of the year, another 50 children had been identified and located. The Holbrook family, Eleanor and Ruth's siblings, had become part of our extended family. They came to dinners, celebrations, the awkward merging of 2 histories into one future. "You gave her the life we couldn't," I told Eleanor one evening. "Whatever the circumstances, David and Ruth loved her. That matters." "And you gave her life itself," Eleanor replied, "and now she has all of us." The financial settlements from the civil suits were substantial. The government, admitting failure of oversight, established a fund for affected families. Sterling's assets were seized and distributed. Some families donated their settlements to missing children organizations. Others used them to finally give their returned children the opportunities they'd missed. Rayleigh used hers to establish a foundation, the Empty Grave Project, dedicated to finding the remaining missing children and supporting families through reunification. "Every empty grave represents a possibility," she said at the launch. "A child who might still be out there, living under another name, feeling like something's always been missing. We're going to find them all." 3 years after that first phone call, we'd found 73 of the 81 children stolen from our region. 8 remained missing, but we never stopped looking. Their photos, age progressed every year, stayed on our website, in post offices, in the hearts of parents who refused to give up. The network was destroyed, but we knew others existed. The market for children, horrible as it was to admit, would always exist. But now we were watching. Now we knew the signs. Now we had systems in place. And sometimes, even years later, we'd get a call. Another child found, another family reunited, another empty grave explained. The biggest revelation came 3 years after Sterling's conviction, from the most unexpected source. Harold's cousin Dennis, who'd been dying of cancer, asked to see me. We'd never been close. He'd lived in Florida, only visiting for funerals and weddings, but he said he had something important to tell me. "Harold came to me in 1988. He wheezed from his hospice bed, right after Rayleigh was taken. He was desperate, talking about killing Brennan, killing himself. I convinced him to live for his other children." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I asked, trying not to sound accusatory to a dying man. "Because I was part of it," he confessed. "Not the network, but I knew people. Sterling had approached me first, actually. Wanted me to identify vulnerable families in Florida. I said no, but I gave him Harold's name. Said he had gambling debts. Might be desperate enough." The room spun. Harold's own family had put us on Sterling's radar. "I didn't know they'd take her," Dennis continued, tears running down his hollow cheeks. "I thought they'd offer him money for information about other families. When I found out what really happened, it was too late. I tried to find her for years. Spent everything I had on private investigators. That's how Harold got some of his information. We were working together, but neither of us could admit how it started." I wanted to be angry, but looking at this dying man eaten alive by guilt, I felt only pity, another victim of the network in his way. "There's more," Dennis said. "I found 3 of them, 3 of the missing children. They're adults now, living in Latin America. Sterling sold them to a family there who couldn't have children. They've been raised as triplets. 3 stolen children raised as siblings." Dennis gave me the information he'd gathered. The Ramirez family in Costa Rica had 3 children, all born within months of each other, all adopted through private arrangements in 1989. The DNA was a match to 3 different missing families from the network's list. Agent Martinez, now heading a special task force on historical child trafficking, took over. The operation to contact the families and the stolen children, now adults in their 40s, was delicate. They had no idea they were stolen. Their adoptive parents, now elderly, had no idea either. They'd been told the children were orphans from various Central American countries. The reunions were complex. 2 of the 3 wanted to meet their biological families. The 3rd refused, saying his real parents were the ones who'd raised him. All valid choices, all painful in different ways. These revelations kept coming. A cluster of children in Australia, a group in Canada. Sterling had been running an international operation, moving children like chess pieces across the globe. Current estimate is over 2,000 children in total, Martinez told me, across 40 years, multiple countries. It's the largest human trafficking ring ever uncovered. 2,000 families destroyed, 2,000 children stolen, 2,000 lies lived for decades. The international trials were even more complex than the domestic ones. Different laws, different jurisdictions, some countries refusing to cooperate. But slowly, justice crept forward. Meanwhile, our families continued to heal and grow. Rayleigh had gotten engaged to David, her patient partner who'd weathered the storm of her identity crisis. The wedding planning was surreal. "So, do I invite my adoptive cousins or my biological cousins?" she asked, staring at the guest list. "Both," I said. "We're all family now, just in a complicated way." The wedding was beautiful chaos, two sets of families merging, children who couldn't quite figure out who was related to whom, elderly relatives trying to understand how someone could have two mothers. Michael walked Rayleigh down the aisle. Harold should have been there, but Michael had stepped into that role naturally. In her bouquet, she carried a photo of Harold, David Holbrook, and Ruth Holbrook, all her parents, present in their way. "Do you, Rayleigh Susan Trevino Holbrook, take this man," the officiant began, and several guests chuckled at the length of her name. She'd kept it all, every piece of her identity. Her vows included a line that made everyone cry, "You've loved me," through discovering I'm not who I thought I was, and helped me become who I really am. At the reception, Eleanor gave a speech about the families we choose and the families we're given, and how sometimes tragedy creates more family than we started with the Chen siblings, reunited after 32 years, performed a traditional Chinese blessing. The Rodriguez family sang a Mexican wedding song. It was a celebration of survival, of found families, of love that transcends traditional boundaries. But even in celebration, we remembered the missing. A table sat empty with 8 photos, the children from our region still not found. Every event, every gathering, we remembered them. One of them, Maria Santos, was found 6 months later. She'd been living in Spain, raised by a diplomat's family. She'd always known she was adopted, but had been told her biological parents died in a car accident in Mexico. The same lie, different country. Her reunion with her family was bittersweet. Her biological mother had died 5 years earlier, never knowing her daughter was alive, but her father and siblings welcomed her back, and slowly they built new relationships on the ashes of old lies. "My mother visited an empty grave every week until she died," Maria's father told us. "She always said she felt Maria was alive somewhere. I wish she'd lived to know she was right." These stories accumulated. The documentary had turned into a series, each episode following different families. Books were written. Academic studies were conducted on the psychological effects of discovered kidnapping in adulthood. We'd become unwilling experts in a field nobody should have to know about. Rayleigh's book, The Girl in the Empty Grave, became required reading in some social work programs. She traveled the country, speaking about identity, trauma, and reconciliation. Her Empty Grave project had reunited 50 more families beyond the network's victims. "Every missing child deserves to be found," she'd say at the end of each speech. "Every family deserves answers. Every empty grave deserves investigation." The project's success led to policy changes. The National Empty Grave Database was established, comparing DNA from unidentified remains with missing persons, reports going back decades. In the first year alone, it solved 300 cold cases, most unrelated to the network, but all representing families who finally got answers. I retired from my work as a principal, but found a new calling in victim advocacy. I testified before Congress multiple times, pushing for stronger oversight of adoption agencies, mandatory DNA testing, and better support for reunified families. "We can't undo what happened," I told a Senate committee, "but we can make sure it never happens again. Every adoption should be transparent. Every child's death should be verified. Every family should have access to DNA testing." The Found Children Act was expanded, providing lifetime support for network victims and their families. Therapy, legal services, financial assistance for reunification travel, acknowledgement that the government's failure of oversight had allowed this to happen. But the real work was personal. Every family had to figure out their own path, some fully integrated with biological and adoptive families merging into one large, complicated unit. Others maintained separate relationships. Some never reconciled at all. "There's no right way to do this," became our support group's motto. "There's only your way." 5 years after that first phone call, we held a massive gathering. 500 people in a convention center, stolen children, biological families, adoptive families, and the children of all of them. Generations connected by crime but sustained by love. The keynote speaker was Tommy Chen, the pediatric surgeon. "We are living proof that family is more than blood or law," he said. "We're connected by something harder to define but impossible to break. The human capacity to love despite loss, to find despite being hidden, to heal despite being broken." The empty grave memorial had been expanded to a national monument, the Garden of Found Children. Each recovered child had a rose bush planted. Each still missing child had a white stone. With their name, families came from around the world to visit, to hope, to remember. Standing there one evening, watching Rayleigh place flowers for the still missing children, I thought about Harold. He'd been weak. He'd made terrible choices that started our tragedy, but he'd also spent 28 years trying to undo it. His records had helped crack the network. His secret surveillance had provided evidence. His guilt had been another kind of prison. "Do you forgive him?" Rayleigh asked, as if reading my thoughts. "I understand him," I said after a long pause. "He was faced with an impossible choice and made the only decision he thought would protect us all. It was wrong, but it came from love and fear, not malice. I forgive him," she said quietly. "Not for letting them take me, but for spending the rest of his life trying to get me back. That took its own kind of courage." 7 years after that impossible 3 a.m. phone call, life had settled into a new kind of normal. Rayleigh and David had 2 children, Hope, now 4, and Harold, 2. Yes, she'd named her son after the grandfather he'd never meet, the man whose choices had led to her disappearance, but whose love had never stopped searching for her. "It's complicated," she'd tell people who asked about the name. But then again, what in our family isn't? The network trials had finally concluded. Sterling died in prison, unrepentant to the end. Most of his lieutenants were serving life sentences. Some had fled the country and remained at large, their faces on wanted posters that would probably yellow with age before they were caught. Of the original 81 children stolen from our region, we'd found 76. 5 remained missing, their families still hoping, still searching. Their photos, updated yearly with age progression technology, stayed on post office walls and milk cartons and websites dedicated to the lost. The support group still met monthly. New families joined occasionally, not network victims, but families dealing with missing children, adoptees searching for truth, people trying to navigate the complex terrain of fractured identity. We'd become accidental experts in impossible reunions. The Found had evolved from a support group to an international organization, chapters in 12 countries, a DNA database that had reunited thousands of families, advocacy that had changed laws worldwide. What started as our personal tragedy had become a global movement. I was 70 now, officially retired but busier than ever. Between congressional testimonies, speaking engagements, and helping new families navigate reunification, retirement was a relative term, but the real joy was in the ordinary moments. Sunday dinners with all my children, the 4 I'd raised and the one who'd found her way back. Grandchildren who called me grandma without questioning why their Aunt Rayleigh looked so much like their parents despite growing up elsewhere. Holiday gatherings that required spreadsheets to organize, but were worth every moment of chaos. Eleanor Holbrook, now 81, had become like a sister to me. We'd joke that we were co-mothers, sharing custody of a 47-year-old daughter. She came to every family gathering, bringing her famous apple pie and stories of Rayleigh's childhood that filled in the gaps of my loss. "Remember when you convinced David you could fly?" Eleanor asked Rayleigh one evening, making everyone laugh. "I jumped off the garage roof with an umbrella," Rayleigh explained to her kids. "Broke my arm. Dad, David, was so panicked he forgot the way to the hospital and drove to the grocery store instead." These stories, mixing both her lives, had become our family lore. The children didn't see them as strange. To them, having multiple grandparents and a family tree that looked like a climbing vine was just normal. Michael had taken over the Empty Grave Project's legal division, using his skills to help families navigate the complex legal issues of late discovery adoption fraud. Jennifer ran support groups for siblings of stolen children, an overlooked group who'd grown up in the shadow of empty graves. Thomas, inspired by his sister's return, had become a social worker, specializing in adoption oversight. "We all found our purposes in this tragedy," he said one evening. "Maybe that's the only silver lining. We're making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The warehouse in Oakland had become a research center. All those records Sterling had kept were being digitized, cross-referenced, analyzed. Every few months, another connection would be found, another family reunited, another empty grave explained. Dr. Chen, the one who'd first told me about Rayleigh, not Tommy the surgeon, had become a friend. He'd started a clinic specifically for people dealing with identity-related trauma. "Your family taught me that healing isn't always about returning to who you were," he said. "Sometimes it's about integrating who you've become." The cemetery had changed too. Rayleigh's empty grave had become a pilgrimage site. Families would leave flowers, toys, photos of missing children. The groundskeeper, who'd watched me visit for 37 years, told me he'd seen hundreds of people find comfort there. "It gives them hope," he said. "If your daughter could come back after all those years, maybe theirs can too." Harold's grave had been updated. The headstone now read, "Harold Ferris, husband and father who loved imperfectly but completely, whose greatest failure led to our greatest joy." It was Rayleigh's idea, a forgiveness carved in stone. One afternoon, I found a woman standing at Rayleigh's empty grave, crying. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. "My daughter disappeared 15 years ago," she said when she saw me. "Everyone says she ran away, but I know something happened. I come here sometimes to remind myself that miracles happen." I sat with her, this stranger united by loss, and told her about the Found organization, about DNA databases, about never giving up hope. She left with resources, connections, and something she'd lost, belief that answers were possible. These encounters happened regularly. We'd become symbols of hope for families trapped in ambiguous loss. Our story, as painful as it had been, proved that sometimes the impossible happens. Sometimes the dead aren't dead. Sometimes empty graves give up their secrets. The international implications continued to unfold. A similar network was discovered in Europe, using the same methods. Another in Asia. The network hadn't been unique. It had been a franchise, a horrifying business model replicated worldwide. "We've identified over 10,000 victims globally," Martinez, now heading an international task force, told me. "Your family's story started an avalanche that's reshaping how the world handles adoption and missing children. 10,000 families, 10,000 stolen children. The number was staggering, but each represented a story like ours. Loss, lies, and sometimes, against all odds, reunion. Not all the stories ended happily. Some of the stolen children had died in their new lives, never knowing their true identities. Some biological parents had passed away waiting, visiting empty graves until their own deaths. Some reunions exploded in anger and recrimination, too much pain to bridge. But for every tragedy, there was a miracle. The siblings separated for 40 years who discovered they'd been living in the same city. The mother who found her son had become a doctor specializing in the rare disease she carried. Driven by genetic memories he couldn't explain, the twins sold to different families who'd always felt incomplete, finally understanding why. Rayleigh had become the unofficial spokesperson for all of us. Her book had been translated into dozens of languages. Her TED Talk on identity and belonging had millions of views. But she remained grounded, focused on the work rather than the fame. Every interview, every speech, every appearance is a chance to find another missing child, she'd say. If being public helps one family reunite, it's worth it. Her children were growing up knowing their complex history. Hope, precocious at 4, had tried to explain it to her preschool class. "My mommy was lost, but not lost," she'd said. "She lived with other parents, but they weren't her real parents, but they were real too. Now she's found, and we have lots of grandmas and grandpas, and it's confusing but good," out of the mouths of babes. Harold Jr., we called him Harry to distinguish from his grandfather, was too young to understand but loved the chaos of large family gatherings. He had the same stubborn chin as Harold Sr., the same green eyes that had helped me recognize Rayleigh that first night. "He looks just like his grandfather," Eleanor said one day, studying Harry's face. "Which one?" Rayleigh asked, and we all laughed because it was true. He looked like Harold, but also had David Holbrook's nose, a genetic impossibility that somehow felt right in our impossible family. The anniversary of that first phone call had become our family's second Thanksgiving. Every November, we'd gather to celebrate not just Rayleigh's return, but everything that had followed, the families we'd found, the laws we'd changed, the empty graves we'd explained. This year was special. The 7th anniversary. 7 years since that 3:17 a.m. call that changed everything. The gathering was huge. All my children and grandchildren, Eleanor and the extended Holbrook family, the Chen family, the Williams family, the Rodriguez family, other found families we'd become close with Agent Martinez, now a family friend, Dr. Chen and his staff, even some of the adoptive families who'd been as much victims as we were. Tommy Chen, the surgeon, gave a toast to empty graves that led to full hearts, to families that shouldn't exist but do, to love that survives lies and time and impossible distances. To Harold, Rayleigh added quietly, who was weak but loved us enough to document everything. Without his guilt and his records, none of us would be here. We toasted Harold, complicated feelings and all. He'd been the catalyst for our tragedy, but also, inadvertently, for our recovery. His gambling had made us vulnerable, but his obsessive documentation had helped destroy the network. He was both villain and victim, perpetrator and hero, lost and found in his own way. After dinner, Rayleigh pulled me aside. "I'm pregnant again." "That's wonderful." I hugged her, then paused. "Boy or girl?" "Girl." "We're naming her Camilla Ruth, after both her grandmothers. Both her grandmothers, me and Ruth Holbrook, united in a granddaughter who would carry both our names. It was perfect in its complexity. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stood in my backyard looking at the stars. Harold and I used to do this when the kids were young, stealing moments of quiet after bedtime chaos. I could almost feel him beside me, the ghost of the man he'd been before October. 1988 broke him. "We found her," I whispered to the darkness. "She's beautiful and complicated and angry and forgiving, and she's ours. All of ours. You were wrong to let them take her, but you were right that she'd be loved, just by more people than either of us imagined. A shooting star crossed the sky. Coincidence, surely, but I took it as a sign. Harold knew. Wherever he was, he knew his daughter had come home. The next morning brought news. Another network child had been found. A 60-year-old man in Sweden who'd always felt something was missing. DNA confirmed he was one of ours. Stolen in 1968, one of the network's first victims. His biological parents were long dead, but he had siblings who'd never stopped wondering about their missing brother. And so it continued. Every found child led to more searches, more hope, more families examining empty graves and wondering. The network was destroyed, but its victims were still being discovered, still coming home decades late, but not too late.
Thank you for listening to this story until the end. Hopefully every moment in the story has touched your heart, brought you some reflection, some emotion, and hope. Thank you for taking the time to experience it with us, and hope that each next story will always accompany you on your life journey.